Do you ever wake up to find a Porsche blocking your barn like it's guarding nuclear codes? That's how my Thursdays started. Just me, a coffee mug, and Veronica Spaulding's cherry red 911 parked sideways across my driveway, like she'd been dared to be that bold. She didn't leave a note. She left a laminated sign that said, "Under investigation signage you'd expect from a neighborhood spy, not a neighbor." And the worst part? I saw her watching from behind her living room blinds, like she was waiting for me to take the bait. I stood there, grease still on my hands, trying to figure out how exactly maintaining farm equipment on land I'd legally owned for 20 years had turned into a federal crisis in the eyes of one woman with a clipboard and a God complex. Leave a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. Porch, recliner, or tractor seat, we don't judge. If you love real feel stories with petty drama, poetic justice, and just enough HOA absurdity to make your blood pressure dance, smash that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's story, let's just say, it makes this one look polite. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, I'm not new to HOA politics. I've lived through sprinkler disputes, mailbox debates, even a rogue bake sale that allegedly violated a zoning rule. But this was something else. Veronica, newly elected queen of the Maple Ridge HOA, had decided my fully permitted agricultural barn was an industrial disturbance. Never mind the fact that my barn had been grandfathered in before the HOA even existed. She marched up the day before, heels clicking like a countdown to crazy, and informed me that the presence of diesel engines threatened the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood. That's a direct quote. She said it while waving a metallic clipboard like it was a holy relic. I tried to stay polite. I showed her the permits, the county approval, even the environmental compliance forms. She looked them over the way a cat looks at a cucumber, suspicious, unimpressed, and deeply offended it even exists. By the next morning, her Porsche was acting like a velvet rope at a club only she ran, blocking my access to the very machines farmers depended on. I had 3 harvest jobs lined up and a storm in the forecast, but I couldn't get my combine out of the barn. Deanna, my wife, asked if we should just call the police. "And say what?" I asked. "Excuse me, officer. Someone parked a 6-figure tantrum in front of my livelihood?" No, this needed more than a phone call. It needed a paper trail. Because I could already tell Veronica wasn't interested in a resolution. She wanted control. And like most folks drunk on their first taste of power, she mistook petty tyranny for civic duty. I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, decibel readings, even soil moisture levels. If she was building a case, I'd build a defense that made hers look like a toddler's crayon drawing of the law. That's when Graham Ellis stepped in. Retired property lawyer, neighbor 2 doors down, and the only man I've ever met who reads land codes for fun. He walked into my kitchen with a folder and a face that said he'd seen this movie before. "She did the same thing in her last neighborhood," he said, flipping through pages. "Got a garden torn up, fined a guy for building a tool shed, ran another couple clean out of town over a wind chime." Turns out, Veronica wasn't just overstepping, she was habitual about it. But I had something none of her past victims had. A fully legal operation and the patience of a man who's spent his life fixing engines built to outlive their owners. I wasn't about to let someone with a laminated title run me off my own land. That weekend, as storm clouds rolled in and neighbors pretended not to notice the HOA drama brewing on my driveway, I fired up my backup plan. A 1983 International Harvester Combine, all 15 tons of it, freshly restored and itching to roll. My son asked me why I was polishing the fenders like I was preparing for war. I told him because sometimes the only way to deal with a blockade is to roll through it. Slow, legal, and loud enough to make a point. Veronica wanted a spectacle. She was about to get one. And if she thought a Porsche could stop a harvest, she was about to learn what real horsepower looks like. There's something surreal about standing on your own land, holding a court summons while a luxury car blocks your barn like it's been deputized. The certified letter came on a Friday morning, delivered by a postal worker who gave me the kind of look usually reserved for foreclosure notices or DNA test results. It was official. Veronica had filed an injunction to shut down my agricultural operations, citing environmental disruption, unauthorized industrial use, and significant community concern. She even included aerial photos and a hand-sketched diagram like she was mapping out an alien landing site. I stared at the papers, then at the Porsche still sunning itself across my driveway, and thought, so this is what HOA war looks like. Petty, polished, and notarized. And if she was trying to scare me, it was working, but not in the way she expected. Deanna read through the court documents while our son Micah sat at the table pretending to color, though I could tell he was listening. She didn't say much at first, just kept flipping pages with that slow, focused energy she reserves for things that might break us. She's not just trying to fine you, Reed. She's trying to erase you. That hit harder than any legal jargon. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the life we built, the roof over our heads, the food in our pantry. Micah finally asked, "Are we in trouble?" And I told him, "No, buddy, we're in a story. But don't worry, your dad's the kind who finishes them strong." The look Diana gave me after that, it said she believed me, mostly. And that little bit of doubt, it made the silence in the house last longer than usual. The weather report didn't help. Forecast said we had 72 hours before a major system rolled in. Thunderstorms with the potential to wreck the fall harvest if crops weren't pulled fast. I had 3 farms on the calendar and no way to access my combine. Every hour lost was another acre drowned. I tried reaching out to Veronica again, left her a voicemail so calm it bordered on eerie. "You're blocking lawful access to emergency equipment during peak harvest season," I said. "I don't think your HOA bylaws are going to like the way the county reacts to that." She never called back. But that afternoon, I noticed the Porsche had been washed and repositioned. Slightly more dramatic, slightly more in the way, like a punctuation mark to everything she wasn't saying. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rules. It was about ego dressed as regulation. The permit in my folder said law. Her car said vanity. Neighbors started to notice the tension. A few waved awkwardly. Some avoided eye contact altogether. I don't blame them. HOA drama spreads like wildfire, and nobody wants to get smoke on their sweater. But one brave soul, old Mrs. Finn from 2 streets over, walked by with her dog and muttered, "This isn't about your barn, it's about her needing to feel bigger than something." That stuck with me, because that's exactly what it felt like. A power play, not a concern. I had county approvals, zoning rights, noise level reports, but none of it mattered to someone who treated authority like a hobby and enforcement like a personality trait. I was learning that truth doesn't matter when someone's building their kingdom on perception, and perception around here came with a laminated HOA badge and a taste for theater. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, permits spread out like a poker hand, trying to figure out my next move. Diana made tea, the way she does when the stress turns electric, and said, "What's it going to take?" I looked out the window at the red Porsche gleaming under the street lamp and said, "A judge, a storm, and maybe a combine with something to prove." She smiled, tired but game. I wasn't sure how this would end, but I knew one thing. Every inch of that barn had been earned, every right documented, every step lawful. And if Veronica thought a car, a sign, or a stack of HOA scare tactics could undo that, she didn't understand the kind of man I was. She hadn't seen what a desperate farmer can do with a deadline, a rainstorm, and a righteous cause, and trust me, she was about to. Would you stand your ground if someone tried to erase your life with a form and a frown? That's what I was asking myself as I watched the clouds start stacking like gray dominoes on the horizon. And that's where the next part of this story begins. Some men mow their lawn on Saturdays. Graham Ellis reads zoning codes for sport. So when I told him about Veronica's court filing and the Porsche blockade, he didn't flinch. He just refilled his coffee and asked for copies of everything. Graham used to be an HOA lawyer back when they actually enforced things like structural integrity and fire safety, not mailbox paint and seasonal flags. He showed up at my house with a briefcase full of paperwork, a worn copy of the Texas Property Code, and a twinkle in his eye like he'd just found a crossword puzzle with real-world consequences. "She's not clever," he said, flipping through the injunction. "She's predictable. That's more dangerous." And right then, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was Graham's, too, and he was treating it like a redemption arc. Over the next 48 hours, we dug. Graham cross-referenced her previous addresses, HOA board minutes, and complaint logs that hadn't seen daylight in years. It was like pulling thread from a sweater. Every tug exposed more damage. Turns out, Veronica had orchestrated the removal of a neighbor's basketball hoop, cited a family for planting tomatoes, and once fined a man $500, 0 cents, for hanging a hammock too close to the sidewalk. These weren't community improvements. These were conquest trophies. "She's a weather vane chasing her own storm," Graham muttered. "Wherever she turns, she claims there's a problem. But the wind? The wind is always her." It was the first time I'd heard legalese sound poetic. And the worst part? No one had ever fought back. Until now. It was Micah who delivered the gut punch. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his crayons, sketching something that looked suspiciously like a red sports car with angry eyebrows. "Dad," he asked without looking up, "why does that lady want to get you in trouble?" Diana froze mid-stir at the stove. I set down my paperwork and gave the only honest answer I had. "Because sometimes, son, people get power and forget how to use it right, and when they see something they can't control, they try to make it go away." He nodded, the way kids do when they're not sure they understand but don't want to break the moment. Then he went back to coloring, with a little more pressure on the crayon than before. That moment stuck with me like diesel on denim. Because now it wasn't just about land, law, or tractors. It was about being the kind of man your kid believes you are when your back's against the wall. Meanwhile, the storm forecast was turning from watch the skies to secure the animals. Radar maps glowed angry red, and the radio was rattling off terms like severe squall line and flash flooding risk. Farmers were calling daily, asking when I could roll out. I had the machines, I had the contracts, but my barn remained blocked by a Porsche and a woman with a mission. Every hour lost was another acre at risk. I started pacing more, sleeping less, and staring out the window like I was expecting cavalry. But what I was really watching for was that moment, the tipping point where the storm outside would no longer be the biggest one coming. That moment was closer than I realized. Graham found it buried in a county bylaw, a clause so specific it read like a secret handshake for property owners. It said that during certified agricultural emergencies, access to essential equipment could not be restricted by private community regulations. He printed it, highlighted it, and slid it across my table like it was Excalibur. "This is your line in the dirt," he said. "Cross it with confidence." For the first time in weeks, I felt the knot in my chest loosen just enough to breathe. The storm was still coming, so was the court hearing. But now I had something real, not just a permit, not just pride. I had the legal equivalent of a lightning rod. And Veronica? She was about to learn that when you play HOA roulette, eventually you land on the name of someone who knows how to fight back. And that next morning, I was ready. But what happened after, that wasn't just a legal shift. It was something else entirely, something louder. You're going to want to stick around for that part, trust me. Some machines sleep like legends waiting to be needed. My 1983 International Harvester hadn't roared in years. But that Sunday morning, I rolled back the tarp like I was unveiling a monument. 15 tons of vintage steel, all gears and growl, the kind of machine that was born before HOA boards started deciding where patriotism ended and beige siding began. I topped off the fuel, checked the hydraulics, and ran a systems test. Everything lit up like an old warhorse answering a bugle call. It was never meant to be a symbol, but that day, it became one. The Harvester wasn't just a tractor, it was a rolling verdict, and I planned to deliver it with the full weight of Texas property law, common sense, and steel-plated resolve. I fired it up, and the sound alone shook birds from trees. But while I was prepping for harvest, Veronica was prepping for spectacle. By the time I rolled around the corner of my own house, she'd formed a makeshift protest camp out front. Her Porsche was flanked by a white SUV and 2 minivans, plus a folding table with pre-printed signs. Protect our air, no industrial zones in homes, and the most ironic of all, respect community standards. I counted 10 people, some I knew, most I didn't, all holding coffee cups and waving banners like HOA had just declared martial law. I kept the harvester slow, 3 miles per hour, because that's how justice works in Texas. Not fast, not loud, just heavy enough that you feel it in your bones. The crowd went quiet when they heard the engine. That sound doesn't ask for permission. It announces presence. And you could tell none of them had planned for that. I brought the combine to a halt about 20 feet from the barn and cut the engine. The silence that followed was richer than any applause. I climbed down with purpose, boots hitting the dirt like punctuation. "Folks," I said, loud but level, "you're trespassing on private property. I have a court order permitting access to my equipment for time-sensitive harvest operations. I suggest you move." Veronica, in her neon vest and lipstick the color of courtroom vengeance, stepped forward and said, "You're threatening peaceful citizens with a machine, Mr. Reed?" I held up the folded court document like it was a peace treaty, written in boldface. "No, ma'am. I'm reminding folks that justice doesn't yield to lawn chairs and laminated opinions." You could feel the temperature shift. Some looked uneasy, others started inching back. But not Veronica. No, she squared her shoulders like the judge's words were a speed bump, not a brick wall. That's when Officer Harris showed up, patrol car tires crunching down the gravel like an approaching deadline. He stepped out, took one look at the harvester, then another at the protest camp, and said, "Lord have mercy." I handed him the order and pointed toward Veronica's blockade. "Sir," I said, "this is an HOA dispute turned full-blown obstruction of a legal operation. I'm within my rights." He read the papers, he read the crowd, then he addressed Veronica directly. "Ma'am, you need to move your vehicle. This property owner is not only permitted, he's court-ordered to proceed." Veronica snapped back, "I'm protecting the community." Officer Harris didn't blink. "Ma'am, right now you're one false move from obstructing justice, and if you're not familiar with that term, the judge who signed this paper will be happy to explain it to you in person." The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't need to. The silence was unanimous. With no dramatic speech and not a word more, Veronica turned, stormed to her Porsche, and started the engine with all the dignity of a kid caught cheating in dodgeball. She backed out slowly, like she still thought the retreat might look strategic. One by one, the other cars followed, chairs folded, signs dropped, and just like that, the blockade collapsed like a bad idea under pressure. And this time, it wasn't just a machine. It was the thunderclap that silenced HOA tyranny. I rolled it into my barn, backed it into place, and didn't even look over my shoulder. Not out of arrogance, but because when justice is that loud, you don't need to see if they heard it. You already know. And if you think that's the end, oh no. That was just the turning point, because after that day the floodgates opened. Stick around. You'll want to see what came out next. When the phone rang at 6:41 a.m., I figured it was another farmer panicked about the storm forecast. Instead, it was Samantha Lynn from Channel 7 News, voice smooth, firm, and full, of the kind of curiosity that usually ends with someone getting very uncomfortable on camera. "Mr. Reed, I heard there was a tractor, a protest, and a Porsche. Mind if we chat?" I nearly spilt my coffee. I wasn't trying to go viral. I was just trying to harvest corn. But apparently someone had posted a video of the standoff, and the internet did what it does best: pour gas on absurdity and light a match. "We'd love to tell your side," she added. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my barn anymore. Veronica hadn't just waged war on me. She'd made herself a national example of how HOA power can spiral from neighborhood order to community theater. Samantha showed up that afternoon with a cameraman and a legal pad filled with bullet points. She wasn't there for fluff. She'd pulled records, public ones, 17 complaints tied to Veronica's time as HOA chairwoman. Some resolved, many ignored, a few quietly settled. Fines for bird feeders, threats over compost bins, one poor family who got cited for having wind chimes that disrupted auditory balance. That's a real quote. Samantha's eyebrows raised higher with each sheet of paper she flipped through. Mr. Reed, you may not realize it, but you've become the reluctant folk hero of suburban justice. I looked out at the barn and thought about the years I'd spent trying to mind my own business. Well, I said, I guess someone had to remind her that property rights don't come with a vanity plate. The cameraman laughed. So did Micah, peeking out from behind the screen door like his dad was famous or something. The story aired that evening at 6, clock sharp. Texas farmer fights back. HOA showdown ends in tractor triumph. There I was, standing next to the International Harvester, hat in hand, trying to look more reasonable than vengeful. They cut in footage of Veronica's blockade, neighbors whispering about years of overreach, and Graham Ellis flipping through HOA bylaws like a priest reading confessions. The response was immediate. My phone buzzed non-stop, calls from farmers, ex-HOA members, even a retired judge who said, "Son, that's the best use of a tractor I've seen in my 40 years on the bench." Comments rolled in. Emails, too. One guy from Michigan wrote, "We need a Reed in every zip code." I didn't know whether to laugh or run for office, but it felt good knowing the world had finally seen what we'd been living through up close. 2 days later, the Willow Ridge HOA board held an emergency meeting. No newsletters, no cookies, just one long agenda item, the motion to remove Veronica Spaulding from her position pending a full audit. Turns out, her use of HOA funds wasn't just excessive, it was creative. Security, consultants, legal preparation services, and a $2,700 0 landscaping bill for preserving aesthetic perimeter cohesion. Translation? She was paying premium rates to remove people's yard gnomes. The vote wasn't even close, 5-0. Her chair was empty before the gavel even fell, and just like that, her little HOA throne cracked like a soggy backyard deck after a hurricane. All that laminated power melted under public scrutiny. It's funny. She fought for control of our block like it was her birthright. But once sunlight hit the paperwork, that control dissolved faster than HOA paint on a power-washed curb. What came next was quieter. The kind of quiet that settles in when a storm passes and you realize your roof held. Folks started waving again. One neighbor brought over pie. Someone anonymously returned a stolen garden gnome to the Fergusons with an apology card. Me? I just kept working. That's all I ever wanted to do in the first place. But now I do it with a little more confidence, knowing that standing your ground doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just takes an engine, a permit, and enough patience to let the truth catch up to the noise. And what happened after this? Oh, trust me, there's still one more twist you'll want to see. Stick around. When the HOA board asked if I'd consider stepping in as interim chair, I nearly choked on my lemonade. Me? Lead the same group that tried to find me out of my own barn? I told them I'd rather wrangle raccoons during mating season. But you've earned the neighborhood's respect, they said. Maybe. But I wasn't interested in becoming what I'd just defeated. Authority doesn't suit everyone. Some of us are better behind a wrench than behind a podium, so I gave them a better name. Graham Ellis. A man who knew the law, had the patience of a saint, and never once tried to weaponize a neighborhood newsletter. They voted him in unanimously. As for me, I went back to fixing engines, planting rows, and enjoying the rare gift of peace in a place that had forgotten what that looked like. But I kept my boots nearby, just in case peace tried to run off again. A week later I saw it, a flatbed tow truck hauling away Veronica's red Porsche like a defeated war trophy. It looked smaller somehow, less sleek, more silly, like a costume someone was done pretending in. I watched it round the corner, disappearing with nothing but dust and the faint smell of old perfume and paperwork. That image stuck with me. The Porsche had been her flag, her throne, her warning flare, but now it was just a car on a truck, heading back to wherever vanity goes when it runs out of an audience. I didn't wave. I just tipped my hat, turned back to my barn, and finally unlocked the side door without feeling like a criminal sneaking into his own life. Little changes started blooming everywhere. The Hendersons put their basketball hoop back up, and this time half the block showed up to help bolt it in. The Patels replanted their backyard garden with more tomatoes, not less, and even set up a little produce stand out front. Kids laughed more, lawn chairs appeared on porches again, and the HOA rules? Graham and the board gutted 14 of the most absurd ones, including the infamous no seasonal decorations taller than 18 inches. That one had banned both a 4th of July eagle statue and a Christmas moose. In a place once ruled by laminated fear, color returned. Actual, literal color. It was like someone turned the saturation back up on a washed-out life. And every time I saw a neighbor smiling in their yard, I thought, that's worth more than any court ruling. One evening, just before sundown, Micah stood beside me as I fueled up the combine. He looked at it like it was some kind of mythical beast. "Can I ride it someday?" he asked, tracing the edge of the fender with one finger. I smiled. "Someday, yeah, when your feet can reach the clutch and your heart steady enough not to chase a fight you don't need to win." He nodded, probably not understanding most of that, but the look on his face said he felt the weight of it. And I realized then that this story, the protests, the permits, the Porsche, was never just mine. It was going to be his too. Maybe not in court documents or newspaper clips, but in how he'd remember what dignity looks like when it's cornered. In how he'd tell his own son someday that there's a difference between having rules and knowing right from wrong. That night, after the tools were put away and the engine cooled, I went out and hung a new sign outside the barn. Not fancy, just carved it myself and nailed it to the post near the gravel. Private property, no trespassing, no Porsches. Diana saw it the next morning and shook her head with a laugh. "Subtle," she said, "like a brick to the forehead." I just grinned. After everything, I figured a little poetry in the signage wouldn't hurt, and if it ever ends up in the background of someone's TikTok, so be it. Let the internet remember that sometimes the most important battles don't come with fireworks, just forged steel, stubborn men, and a court order held firm by a grease-stained hand. So now, life moves on. The combine runs smoother than ever, the barn's wide open, and Micah's drawings these days feature less red cars and more tractors. As for Veronica, last I heard she moved in with her sister 2 towns over, and someone else got to explain why the HOA newsletter still opens with, "From the desk of the former chairwoman." But that's none of my business anymore. Around here, we've got harvests to finish, fences to mend, and new neighbors to welcome, assuming they don't bring bylaws with their casseroles. Because in Texas, sometimes the law shows up wearing steel, gears, and a farmer's grin. And as I stood there, watching the sun sink behind my barn, the same barn that nearly got erased by a clipboard and a Porsche, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Stillness. Not silence, not boredom, stillness. The kind that tells you you've fought the right fight, on the right soil, with the right reasons. I didn't win because I yelled the loudest or drove the fanciest car. I won because I stood where I belonged and refused to move for anyone who couldn't understand the difference between power and principle. What this whole mess taught me, what I hope it teaches you, is that respect isn't something you laminate and hang on a lanyard. It's something you earn when you treat people fairly, when you don't abuse rules to push your neighbors into corners. And when you get pushed into a corner, you don't swing first. You square your shoulders, hold your ground, and let the truth do the talking. Sometimes that truth shows up with a permit. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a 15-ton harvester. So if you've ever been steamrolled by someone louder, richer, or better connected, just remember, They don't win unless you stop standing. And if your community's been robbed of its color, kindness, and common sense, maybe it's time to check who's holding the clipboard and who's holding the door open. If this story made you laugh, nod, or whisper, "Dang right," under your breath, do me a favor, drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, or share your own HOA horror story. And hey, hit that like button, give us a subscribe, and ring that little bell so you don't miss the next episode. Because trust me, the next one, it's got more twists, more grit, and yes, probably another clipboard. This is Reed signing off from a quiet barn, a fixed fence, and a family worth fighting for. Stay strong, stay sharp, and remember, some laws are written in ink, but the best ones, they're carved into the land.